Scaling impact in disruptive times is our theme for these 2 days. All sessions are organized in 4 streams: enabling environment, prosperous farmers, empowered communities, and healthy planet. In a few minutes, with the help of the World Bank, we will try to understand the global context and what's in store during these disruptive times. After that, we will have a session on climate action with UK Minister of Environment, Zach Goldsmith. And our final plenary session today will assess where we are in the fight against child labor with the International Cocoa Initiative. You will then have the opportunity to join one of 6 breakout sessions for smaller group learning and engagement. All this content, again, will be recorded and available to you later on at the close of the day. In addition, we will be hearing from our most important partners, cocoa farmers themselves, who have sent videos to let us know how they are doing during these disruptive times. We will also hear from the World Cocoa Foundation President, Rick Scobey, who will welcome all of you to the partnership meeting. To kick us off, I would like to thank our gold sponsors, Mondelez International, as well as all the sponsors without whom none of this would be possible. Please join me in welcoming Christine McGrath, Vice President and Chief of Global Impact at Mondelez International, who will make some remarks. Welcome, Christine.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am Chris McGrath from Mondelez International, where I lead sustainability and am responsible for our signature sustainability program, Cocoa Life. I also serve on the World Cocoa Foundation board and am vice chair of the executive committee. I wish that we could be in person for this conference. It is a little strange to be talking to you on a screen. And I want to congratulate and thank Rick and the team at WCF for organizing this virtual event. They've really risen to the challenge and planned an insightful and inspiring program. It's so important that this event take place this year because we need to continue our focus on sustainability and the future of this important commodity, even in the midst of the COVID pandemic. In fact, I would argue it's never been more important to maintain our collective focus and commitments to sustainability. Our farmers will benefit, our consumers, our stakeholders, and employees will appreciate it, and all of our businesses will be better for it. That's why the theme of continuing to scale our impact in uncertain, disrupted times is such a fitting one for this year's event. Let me take a moment to tell you a little bit about who we are as a company and how we approach cocoa sustainability. I think you all know MDLZ, Mondelez. We're one of the world's biggest snacking companies, creating delicious products for millions of people all over the world, with beloved chocolate brands such as Cadbury, Milka, and Côte d'Or. Our mission is to lead the future of snacking by offering the right snack for the right moment, made the right way. We call this snacking made right. Snacking made right is the lens through which we see everything that we do and a framework for our sustainability and well-being agendas. Offering the right snack means having a broad portfolio ranging from wholesome to indulgent snacks that meet consumers' evolving snacking and well-being needs. The right moment means meeting consumers where they are and helping people consume our products more mindfully. Made the right way means managing our supply chains sustainably in ways that minimize our impact on the planet, as well as taking a stand to respect the rights and well-being of all people our business touches. Cocoa is the essence of our chocolate and vital to our business, so we ensure it is made right. Making it right means tackling the complex challenges that cocoa farmers face, including climate change, gender inequality, poverty, and child labor. Our Cocoa Life program is how we deliver this, through a $400 million 10-year commitment. Cocoa Life is addressing these challenges on the ground, working hand in hand with the men and women who make their living from cocoa, focusing where we can make a difference. turning cocoa into a business of choice, creating inclusive and empowered communities, and educating on forest conservation and restoration. In doing so, we are growing opportunities for cocoa farmers and their families by tackling these problems together in an integrated way. And we're making great progress. At the end of 2019, there were over 175,000 farmers registered with Cocoa Life, and we are on track to meet our commitment to reach over 200,000 cocoa farmers by 2022. Furthermore, 63% of our cocoa volume for our chocolate brands is now sourced through Cocoa Life, which brings us even closer to our goal of 100% by 2025. And of course, we can't do this on our own. An important part of our success is the work that we do with our partners, and this includes the World Cocoa Foundation. Turning to the topic of this conference, scaling impact in uncertain times, concerted multi-stakeholder action is what we need to continue to drive change, and this is the right forum to do it. As I mentioned, the challenges in cocoa are many. We believe the most powerful means to unlock progress across all of these challenges is by raising farmer income overall. If we want to try to tackle one issue in isolation or make a competitive differentiator out of one aspect of the problem at the expense of others, we risk not making progress overall. If we look holistically, however, we will get much further. A lot has been done on farmer income. We welcome government efforts to increase living income for farmers through the living income differential. This is now reflected in pricing, and we are paying it. But we continue to believe that there is more that we can do as a sector to understand and improve the situation on the ground. With more knowledge on income at the farm and community level, we can better develop appropriate efforts to improve it and set the right expectations of the progress we can make and by when. To start to address this, we at MDLZ have done research into farmer income with Wageningen University, which will be published soon. Our research shows that the income gap for all farmers to reach a living income is significant despite all of our best efforts. We're encouraged by the strong progress in our program, where we see Cocoa Life farmers earning 22% more than the national average. However, the research we've done also shows that only some cocoa farmers will be able to reach a living income through cocoa alone. To close the gap for all, we need a growing and diversified rural economy. No actor can achieve this alone, and new ways of collaboration using the strengths of all actors in the sector and beyond are what's needed. We are ready to do that. And you can hear more about this in a panel tomorrow, where my colleague Kathy Peters will speak. Disruptive times can be a risk to progress and can lead to deviations from our path. It's important that we keep on track and continue our focus on the sustainability of the cocoa sector. We've used an expression in our company to manage through the COVID crisis, stronger together. We believe strongly that by working together with others through programs like Cocoa Life that take a holistic approach to tackling root causes, we will have the greatest impact. In this context, the focus on farmer income can be a powerful unlock in cocoa farming and a way to tackle multiple challenges. We support the efforts of the governments thus far, and we need yet more collaboration to continue to make progress in this important area. On that note, I wish you a successful conference and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Stay well, stay safe. Thank you.
My name is Isaac Zinov. I'm 17 years old. I'm a student of Community High School, Aotunde, Ijebu East. My father is a cocoa farmer.
Inés María Coronel. Somos gustosos para trabajar del cacao porque nos gusta demasiado. Somos nacidas mismos de aquí, este recinto que es Los Ángeles.
The friend Janet Ajaben. I didn't fear Junior Watch. Me fear crossing Iowa and Fano South, West. Mawari. Me won't cram answer. They will Canada in Fiancia. They toss me in Fiancia. Near do dear chin, and swear the affair.
Pues la finca cacaotera y en especial esta es una finca que es un muy buen negocio. Lo digo porque gracias a Dios y a este cultivo del cacao hemos podido sacar adelante a nuestros hijos, a estos 5 hijos que hemos tenido en nuestro matrimonio y que todos, gracias a Dios, han logrado pues ser profesionales.
Your family Grace Chu. Me dim fie 27 years. Na, me free, nyame bachelor. Wa Hafano South, East, Ghana. Mi coco fue bese canson.
Mi nombre es Rosibel Messi Celedón, soy de la comunidad de Laberinto, soy productora de cacao. Me gusta trabajar con el cacao, me encanta el cacao. Me gusta cultivarlo, andar allí. Si yo no ando en el cacao, aunque tenga a mi hijo, pero a mí me encanta andar ahí. En la cosecha, en cuidarlo, todo me gusta andar.
Jerusalem, Ghana. The size by 7 acres. Yeah, me tissue. Pale. Na me kuno de wa free. Na ka me ne memba enson. Ya o mo nyinyi kakadu di kana nyemfie be aduanan ni akire.
Perkenalkan dulu, nama saya Koma Mudiana, dipanggil Kemangtin nama udaranya. Alamatnya Banjar Musemare, Desa Mangkangin, Kecamatan Mendoyo, Kabupaten Jemberana, Bali. Kami memilih tanaman kakao di sini karena kenatipun di musim pandemi ini sudah pasti bisa dapat dikirim keluar dari biji kering fermentasi itu ya. Karena itu dari pengiriman itulah kami percaya dan sangat bangga, kami sangat senang bisa membantu beban keluarga kami seperti anak-anak sekolah itu bisa terbantulah karena di musim pandemi ini bisa berjalan kakao itu dan bisa terkirim sampai ke luar negeri.
Como productor de cacao, pienso que todavía el negocio del cacao, para mi concepto, sigue siendo un negocio sostenible hasta el momento. Inclusive en esta pandemia, como productor podría decir que ha sido la fuente de ingreso durante todo este tiempo para nosotros y nos ha sostenido.
El coronavirus sí nos afectó bastante en el momento que estábamos, como dice, de emergencia. Pero ahora ya con la protección y todo, como la vida sigue adelante y con la bendición de Dios y tanto protegiéndonos, cuidándonos cada uno de nosotros, porque cada uno de nosotros somos responsables de nuestra vida. Y estamos ya saliendo adelante con la cosecha del cacao, lo que nos dedicamos a la cosecha de cacao. Estamos siguiendo adelante, gracias a Dios.
Since COVID-19, ya ba ma bla bom ni se. Ya le esa ya le yintino. Yintimi ntoshe ye ne. Aka ne no na niema wo fom. Esa nse na boda mu nyina ededa ho. Ntino na omutimi kra niema bebre ba ntino niema eye. Na ene die yeteto boda mu ntino. Niema bo ya din. O ma so na won sa agene. Esa ne ntino ade ahunyenyi akase pa na aba ma bra bom. Ene mi madwuma emu soso no. Esa yale yintino ene yale emanipa embum fasasa kane ayefro wa ha eye wa ha ye tu ebadin tu obi wa ha ne sa na eba ne sa ne nkofo pamade ya pa nso so yale yintino ene pamade eti yo fo nso kola nya adwuma school kura nso na ya tutumi ebe bi school ne mo fe nso so amade sia nyina aye basa nti yale bia ahampa
Eba chopo se o chama aye no boy pa if we say ya corona yetino no enkane ni ha entino pina ni TV amohwe And radio so cry ho de my Franziska na yede to.
I like the part that they teach us now to keep social distance and put on our face masks. And we have to stay at home for some months. And we wash our hands regularly to protect myself from coronavirus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Scobey, the president of the World Cocoa Foundation. I want to extend a very warm welcome to this year's annual partnership meeting. We'd originally planned this year's meeting to be held in Bogota, Colombia, but of course, COVID changed that. We debated about canceling the event, but as Chris McGrath noted in her remarks, we decided that it was more important than ever for the cocoa family to come together and connect on key issues. As we just saw on the video, cocoa farmers around the world are facing unprecedented challenges in response to the health, economic, and social impacts of COVID. Indeed, all of our lives, no matter where you live or what you do in this supply chain, have been affected by the pandemic. At this difficult moment in time, all of us want to do more to ensure a thriving, sustainable, and just cocoa sector. That's why we wanted to bring everyone together this year around the theme of scaling impact in disruptive times. One of the benefits of moving to a virtual event is that we're able to reach a much broader audience from around the world. More than 400 participants have signed up for this meeting from 32 countries on 6 continents. I'm particularly pleased that we have 40 member companies of WCF with us, as our diverse membership is our greatest asset. I want to thank the WCF team that rose to the challenge to figure out how to design a dynamic virtual event, and particularly Charlotte Grant, Zoe Genova, and Alex Ferguson, who've been the engines behind this program. I also want to express my sincere thanks to the companies who supported this year's virtual event. Mondelez as the gold sponsor, Mars Wrigley as agenda sponsor, silver sponsors of Barry Callebaut, Cargill, Compagnie Nationale de Chocolat, GCB Cocoa, Lucre Chocolate, and also the bronze sponsors of Ecom and Olam, and the cocoa contributors of Ferrero and Supton. Friends, truly, a lot has happened in the cocoa sector since we last met 1 year ago in Berlin. I'd like to flag 5 important developments over the past year. First, clearly, the COVID pandemic has significantly disrupted every part of the cocoa supply chain. Cocoa grindings declined by about 15% in the second and third quarters of 2020 compared to the previous year. This decline in demand has sent cocoa prices sharply lower and has contributed to a decline in global cocoa purchases. These market developments have created significant risks and adverse impacts for everyone in the supply chain. Our top priority, however, must be to protect the lives and livelihoods of the millions of cocoa farmers around the world who are facing significant health and economic risks as a result of the COVID crisis, just like we heard in the opening video. This is why WCF companies came together back in April and May and made a donation of more than $835,000 to help farmers in West Africa, Asia, Latin America to fight COVID-19. And this was on top of numerous individual contributions of companies that have totaled hundreds of millions of dollars. Second important development that I want to flag, over the past year, we've seen a growing global focus and commitment to achieving a living income for cocoa farmers. The industry has continued to work closely with the origin governments, with farmers and other partners to make cocoa farming truly sustainable and profitable, with transformation of farms into modern businesses that enable farmers to earn sufficient income to achieve a decent standard of living. The industry has been very clear that we support the new living income differential policy that Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana introduced in July 2019 as part of a shared strategy to raise farmer income. our company members have independently and voluntarily incorporated the lid into all of their individual procurement plans for the 2021 crop season. The Conseil du Café Cacao and Ghana Cocoa Board have recently flagged some concerns about the decline in cocoa purchases and the implementation of the lid during the past months of the COVID pandemic. We will hear more about this from J.B. Aidu, the Chief Executive of the Ghana Cocoa Board, tomorrow. There's no question that we all are facing a difficult cocoa market. More than ever, it is critical that industry and the government engage in a meaningful dialogue about how to protect farmer income at a time of reduced global demand, continued market uncertainty, and a 2019-2020 market surplus, according to the latest ICCO forecast. These are real and complex issues, and we must come together and talk through, within the confines of antitrust law, how to best manage risk and volatility in this difficult market, and how we can most effectively and efficiently maximize the long-term income of farmers. Now, as we focus on increasing farmer income, we must also ensure that the cocoa is grown responsibly. As the Conseil and Cocoa Board said 1 year ago at our last partnership meeting, quote, the lid and the sustainability programs would coexist and complement each other, unquote. We continue to believe this is the right approach. The lid and the company sustainability programs are both essential and mutually reinforcing. They're two sides of the same coin. We cannot ensure the long-term sustainability of this sector without farmers receiving fair remuneration for their crop. Likewise, a long-term increase in farmer remuneration must come from responsible cocoa production, with due attention to child labor, deforestation, and stable long-term supply-side management. Company sustainability programs are playing a critical role to boost farmer income, ensure a responsible supply chain, and accelerate achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. These company programs directly help almost 700,000 farmers and their families, which is about 45% of all cocoa growers in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. We have an exciting panel tomorrow on new work related to living income in the cocoa sector, which I hope you will sign up for. Third important development over the past year is that we have seen encouraging results on the critical issue of climate change and deforestation. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity issued a major report, which they do once every 5 years, this past September, which indicated that from 2018 to 2019, the rate of forest loss was halved in both Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and it specifically recognized the work of the industry in this result. Quote, several policies and actions have contributed to this success, including the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. This initiative is a partnership between the two countries and the World Cocoa Foundation, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, the International Sustainability Unit of the Office of the Prince of Wales, and private cocoa companies to create an enabling environment for the cocoa sector to contribute positively to the preservation of forests and the economy of the two countries, unquote. We have an important dialogue later this morning with UK Environment Minister, Lord Goldsmith, and tomorrow morning with the new Chief Executive Officer of the Global Environment Facility, Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, which will look at these issues of climate change and environmental sustainability in more detail. We're very pleased to be working closely with the UK government this year in preparations for COP26 in Glasgow in November of 2021. The fourth important development I want to flag is that we're making progress on the persistent challenge of child labor in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. The recent report by the Nork Research Institute at the University of Chicago showed that there is today still too many children in cocoa farming doing work for which they're too young or work that endangers them. The report indicated that earlier targets that were set to reduce child labor were set without fully understanding the complexity and the scale of a challenge that's associated with poverty in rural Africa. It nonetheless showed that government and company programs to reduce child labor are making a difference. The report emphasizes that more than 60% increase in total cocoa production in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana over the past 10 years did not bring a similar surge in child labor. Separate analysis by NORC and by the International Cocoa Initiative have shown that hazardous child labor has been reduced by 1/3 in communities where company child labor remediation programs are operating. And it's been reduced by 1/2 among those child laborers who were identified by specific company due diligence measures. These are important and powerful findings. We now know more about what works, and we are scaling up these efforts for impact. In a session later this morning, led by my good friend Nick Wetherill from ICI, you will hear more about how industry is deepening commitments and developing stronger multi-sector, multi-stakeholder collaboration to tackle the root causes of child labor. The fifth and final development I want to flag is that we have seen a deeper focus on cocoa sustainability in the legislatures of cocoa consuming countries, including increased attention to regulatory options to ensure corporate due diligence and responsible supply chains. We have a very important session planned tomorrow with EU Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen and European Parliament Vice President Heidi Hautala on important and interesting developments that are underway in the European Union. I hope you'll be able to join us for that discussion. Industry has welcomed these regulatory developments in the EU, in the United States, and other markets. We believe that effective protection of human rights and environmental standards in the supply chain requires 3 complementary actions. First, government regulations to set clear standards for environmental and social due diligence. Second, strong public and private partnerships to catalyze joint action of companies and government. And third, increased aid and trade flows to finance key interventions in producer countries at national scale. Let me close by again welcoming you to the partnership meeting. There is an African proverb that says, wisdom does not come overnight. We are all on a shared journey to enhance the sustainability of the cocoa sector and improve the livelihoods of cocoa farmers, their families, and their communities. The farmer video that we showed at the beginning of my remarks opened up with 17-year-old Isaac Zanab from Ghana. I hope that our discussions over the next 2 days enrich our understanding and inspire us to work harder to accelerate inclusive and sustainable growth in cocoa during these disruptive times for Isaac and his family and all the cocoa farmers around the world. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you over the next 2 days in all the different virtual events. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Rick, for those welcoming remarks and of course for framing the 2020 partnership meeting. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, Franziska Ohnsorge, manager of the Prospects Group at the World Bank. Franziska is a co-author of the World Bank's Global Economic Prospects Report. She previously worked at the International Monetary Fund and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We asked Franziska to speak at the partnership meeting so we can get an idea of what kind of a world we face due to COVID-19's impact on the global economy. I'll be asking Franziska a number of questions, but feel free to add your own to the chat in the event we can get to them. Franziska, thank you for joining us today, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Buddy. Thank you. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to today's event. It's now more important than ever that the global community comes together. So events like today's are incredibly important to keep us together. Now, I'm looking forward to discussing the economic outlook with you. Next slide, please. So in the next 5 minutes, I'll touch on 3 questions. First, what are the near-term global growth prospects? Second, what are the risks to this outlook? And third, what are the long-term economic implications of the pandemic? Next slide, please. So let's start with the near-term growth prospects. As the video has shown us in a very touching way, the COVID pandemic is a global disaster that touches all of us. So the pandemic has plunged the global economy into its deepest recession since the Second World War. If you're hurting, you know that you're not alone. It's the global economy that is hurting. Here you see in the chart on the left, the comparison in per capita income growth in the past global recessions over the past century and a half. Since 1870, there have been 14 of such events. This 2020 pandemic recession is almost twice as steep as the last global recession in 2009, right after the global financial crisis. This year, this global recession is the worst the world has seen since 1945-46, when the Second World War ended. It's not only deep, as you see in the chart on the right, it's also really broad-based, as the chart on the chart on the left shows you the depth of the recession. The chart on the right shows you the breadth of it. It touches 90% of countries. It has tipped 90% of the world's economies into a recession. You can see that here, that spike here in 2020 in the chart on the right. Really, there has been nothing like this since the Great Depression in the 1930s. This is a recession that hits the world, virtually every country in the world. And in fact, this is the first recession, outright output contraction in emerging markets and developing countries' economies, in as long a data series as we can create. The data goes back to about the 1970s. So since the 1970s, emerging market and developing economy output has not contracted in all that period until 2020. This is truly exceptional. The only ones, I mean, on a global scale, this is something we have not seen in almost 100 years. Now, next slide, please. Now, looking forward to the outlook, the previous slide showed you how bad it is in 2020. Let's look forward to 2021. The left and the right charts here show you consensus forecasts for 2020 on the left and for 2021 on the right. Now, as you can see, consensus forecasts have collapsed since the pandemic started in sometime around the spring to a global contraction of 4 to 5%, with quite a bit of variation around it. This contraction is so severe that it has reversed years of income gains in advanced economies as well as emerging markets and developing economies for 1/4 of advanced economies and EMDEs. It has reversed a decade of income gains. As you can see here in the center chart, these red bars. Now for 2021, consensus forecasts are now for a rebound to about almost 5%, but there is still tremendous uncertainty about this rebound, as you can see in that large range in the blue bar in the chart on the right. And consensus forecasts are increasingly ruling out their more optimistic forecasts. So this range over the last few months has been narrowing from the top. Now our World Bank forecasts that we published in June are towards the bottom bound of these ranges. We do expect a modest recovery in 2021. A recovery above the kind of growth that can be sustained in the long run at full capacity and full employment. But that's not enough to reverse the output losses of 2020. And there are several risks that can delay this outlook. For all we know, they're materializing as we speak. The most pressing ones are, of course, that the pandemic intensifies, or is more prolonged than we had anticipated. Or it's the possibility of a financial crisis, broad-based financial stress, perhaps because of an intensifying or longer pandemic. Next slide, please. And a return to the pre-pandemic path is unlikely. Even much milder recessions in the past 40 years have been associated with lasting output losses. This is the exercise we conducted for these charts, these two charts here. We looked at all the recessions over the last 40 years, and none of them have been as bad as the current one or as synchronized. And we estimated what happened to potential output, the long-term sustainable output after, at full capacity and full employment. What happened to potential output after these historic recessions for about 100 emerging markets and developing economies. And as you can see here in the chart on the left, we find that the average run-of-the-mill recession output contraction lowered this potential output, this long-term sustainable output, 5 years later, 5 years after the recession, by almost 6%, as you can see here in the chart on the left. And if it was accompanied by a financial crisis, the potential output losses were even steeper. You can see that in the last bar in the chart on the right. So if you have a recession and a financial crisis, output losses are much steeper, even 5 years after the recession. So for now, monetary policymakers around the world deserve credit for having averted such a scenario thus far, but we're not out of the woods yet. This is one of the key concerns of one of the key risks we see going forward. So next slide, please. So just to summarize, what are the prospects for the near term? I mean, we are emerging from the deepest global recession since the Second World War, but it's a subdued recovery. What are the risks to the outlook? They're clearly to the downside, and many are related to the path of the pandemic. And that could be compounded by financial stress. And third, what are the long-term implications of the pandemic? Well, already the pandemic has caused a lost decade for many advanced economies and emerging markets and developing economies. We are unlikely to return to the pre-pandemic path in the next few years. I look forward to our discussion now. Thank you very much. Buddy, over to you.
Wow, Franziska, I'm speechless. My first question was about, this point that you had made about this as being the worst recession since World War II, and wondering if, the World Bank worst feared has been realized, but it seems from the data that is likely to be the case. So I wanted to ask you, with regards to the outlook going forward in 2021, you mentioned that there's not likely to be much improvement in the short term. Does that take into account, just the first wave of the COVID, or if indeed these vaccine trials and all that are successful, then could there be a more optimistic outcome going forward?
Yes, so things will improve. I mean, things have already improved from the dog days of this global recession. March, April was really the depth of it. So things have improved. Global goods trade, for example, is almost back up to pre-pandemic levels. We do expect things to improve. It cannot stay like this. Right. But it will not, whatever improvement is going to happen is going to be moderate and will not be sufficient, at least in the next year, to undo the losses of 2020. Now, you're very right. There is an upside risk. Perhaps there's an upside risk in the short run as well as in the long run. So perhaps we bring the pandemic under control surprisingly quickly, much faster than we had anticipated. Maybe that vaccine will be rolled out much faster than anticipated. So there is an upside risk, and that could then trigger a confidence, sort of a self-reinforcing virtual cycle of confidence improvements, and perhaps things will look much better. For now, however, if it seems that momentum is slowing, if anything, because that second wave is underway. Sure. Yeah, so the economic impact was perhaps not quite as severe as many forecasters had expected in the second quarter and the third quarter, but now things are clearly losing momentum again as the second wave is getting underway. There's also an upside scenario for the long term. I mean, maybe the fact that we are sitting here now with all of us looking at each other on screens, maybe that is the beginning of a technology boost. Maybe there will be a big boost to productivity, but we have to see whether that materializes.
Sure. Okay, so one thing that we are hearing about is, build back better, build back green. I want to pose the question to you: in all the previous recessions and productivity dips that you have seen as a result of financial crises, governments have responded pretty much in the same way, tried to get back to where they were. But there's a lot of discussion within this particular pandemic about trying new things, having a little bit of an innovative view at how to restart economies and restart them in a more sustainable way, in a way which is perhaps even for the people who are engaged in this partnership meeting, more considerate to people who are along the value chain. What are your views on what the opportunities are on that, especially given that I imagine that that would require a pretty significant investment from governments who are already facing quite a tight resource envelope?
Absolutely, that's an excellent point. Building back better is critical. And this is what often happens after recession. So if you think back to the global financial crisis, afterwards there's a big push to improve financial regulation. Or think back to the oil price plunge of 2014 to 16. Afterwards, oil exporters made a big push to reform, diversify their economies. And some of these reforms have actually helped them as the oil price collapsed in March this year. So this kind of thing, these crises tend to bring home to people the importance of reforms, and they are often followed by improvements. Now, on the particular improvements here, I think this particular crisis has brought home to us the fragility of some of the education systems, for example, of some of the supply chains. So I'm sure there will be companies, corporates at a disaggregated level are going to move to build more resilience into the system. Now, governments are, you're absolutely right, governments are heavily constrained in what they can do. Government debt, even before the pandemic, was at a record high. Many don't have much space to help. That doesn't mean that they can't do anything. Governments have a lot of levers to implement reforms that remove red tape, that improve markets, that improve efficiency of spending. They don't need to cost much. They can just take some of the sand out of the wheels of their economies. So a lot of emphasis can still be put on government policy, the type that is perhaps not as expensive, but can be just as effective or even more effective over the long term.
That's interesting. That's an interesting idea that, some of the inertia already in the system can be addressed without additional investments. That's a great concept. So given that we are, in a cocoa conference, can you give me your views on what this pandemic, what the implications are for non-commodity dependent countries as opposed to commodity dependent countries?
That distinction was incredibly clear in 2014 and 16 when all commodity prices plunged. All of them collapsed. And actually, I should say from the peak in 2011 to 2016, that was a synchronized collapse in commodity prices. All commodity exporters were hit. So the world economy actually, because a lot of the world's countries are actually commodity exporters, the world economy went into a slump in 2016. It is not so clear now. So there was a sharp reduction in oil prices in March and April, because oil prices, energy is something that is used in the industries that are really hit by the pandemic, travel, transport. Those are the two industries that have been locked down severely. So oil prices are really hit. But actually the other commodity prices, first they were not hit as much, and second they recovered. So many of them are now back to pre-pandemic levels. And we've explored this in much greater depth in our commodity markets outlook that's available on the World Bank website and was just launched in October. It is actually quite astonishing how differently oil prices that are sensitive to the lockdowns have moved from the other commodity prices. So that brings us into your question, how are commodity exporters, what challenges are they facing compared to commodity importers? Actually, for once, these other than oil exporters, they face very similar challenges. They face a really adverse global environment. They face low growth, sputtering growth in advanced economies, which is probably a large share of their export markets. The one exception, the one bright spot there being China. Anyone who exports to China is better off because they have rebounded very rapidly. They face a lot of domestic challenges because of domestic outbreaks also have to be controlled. For now, they face benign financing conditions, but that is, of course, always a risk that turns. And at this point, this is a challenge faced by commodity importers as well as commodity exporters, with the exception of the energy exporters.
I see. Wow. Well, that's an exception that we would not have welcomed from previous financial shocks. But I guess, we are learning the hard way in this particular time. I'd like to switch gears to discussing, what is the impact on extreme poverty? Because the report points out that this recession is going to push millions of people into extreme poverty. And indeed, we have a question from Abubakar Aful, who's pointing to this same issue along the value chain down to the farmer level. What recommendations does the report make around addressing the fall into, the slide back on the gains, the poverty reduction gains that have been made over the past few decades, and how can those recommendations be applied within the cocoa value chain, where of course farmers, many of them are still, teetering on that cusp of poverty.
Yeah, that is actually the saddest part of the pandemic. So our recently published Poverty and Shared Prosperity report estimates that compared to the pre-pandemic expectations, poverty will rise by 88 to 115 million, depending on million people, depending on which growth scenario plays out. And that sets back several years of poverty reduction. So this is one of the saddest parts, and it often hits population groups that thought that they were moving up. It hits those that don't have access to government support programs because they're not quite at that extreme poverty threshold. It hits the middle that had just risen above the poverty threshold, tips them back into poverty. This is the saddest part of the pandemic. What can be done? Okay, that depends on the country. What can be done? It's very difficult. So in some countries, these support systems actually work. They do reach the poorest. So there is an effective mechanism of delivering support. But in many countries, informality is widespread. These people are very hard to reach by government policy. So for example, we did a big study on informality in emerging markets and developing economies, much of it in the agricultural sector. In the average EMDE, 70% of employed are actually in the informal sector, often in agriculture. They're out of the social safety net. They're not banked. Only a quarter of those informal firms have bank accounts. So how would you reach through standard mechanism? How would you reach them? You have to come up with some very innovative mechanism. Mm-hmm. And the second problem is that these companies and people, they work in very close quarters in exactly the kind of industries that are vulnerable to the spread of the pandemic, in services often. So that's besides agriculture, many of them are in services. And when you start having shutdowns, you're hitting some of the most vulnerable people without much possibility of providing support. It's a massive challenge for governments.
Right. So I mean, is the only option then some of the mechanisms that we see in the West, where governments are essentially providing stimulus to citizens going into a lot of debt because private sector cannot step up in any significant way, and then essentially the hope is that you have to try and ride that out as much as possible. As much as resources are possible, and then you begin rebuilding at a later date. There's really no different model that can be followed. That's my first question. And secondly, we haven't seen that particular approach being taken in the developing world to that extent, obviously, because resources are more limited. So within the context of cocoa producing countries, what does the report, or in your view, what are the recommendations around how to address this slide into poverty, and what mechanisms from a policy perspective, or perhaps also from a private sector perspective, for our WCF members who are watching and engaging with these farmers, that they can employ to really make a little bit of a safety net, or to fortify the safety net for these populations.
Yeah, that's really the difficult question. But I must say, governments in emerging markets, developing economies have actually stepped up. They have implemented stimulus like they have never done before, not even 2008-9. It's not just advanced economies that are doing it. We document that actually in our report. They've implemented something between 2 and 4% of GDP of fiscal stimulus on average. They have really gone all out to do things. The central banks in many countries have done the unthinkable. They've started asset purchases like in advanced economy central banks, trying to support, keep credit flowing, keep financial stability, keep just sort of financial system ready to support economic activity. So really, policymakers have gone all out to address the pandemic. Now, yes, there is some evidence it's difficult to reach. Some of the poorest are very difficult to reach. And it looks like families, households themselves have fallen back on their own insurance mechanisms. Where government fails, households have stepped up. So for example, we had originally expected that remittances would plunge simply because of the deep contraction around the world. What has happened instead in a lot of countries is that actually remittances have picked up. It looks like a lot of households are digging into their pockets and trying to support each other, falling back onto informal mechanisms.
That's actually that's very interesting. That hopefully means that there's a higher level of saving among these communities that are elsewhere, that are able to provide some sustenance to people within countries that are suffering, to their families in countries where they have fewer options. That's quite that's refreshing actually, because I think the forecast on remittance dropping was almost in the 20% type range from the bank. So that's interesting to know that it's not been that deep. Unfortunately, we are getting to the end of our session. This has been really interesting. I started by saying I was speechless because I almost felt like I needed to take a 5-minute break to digest the gloom and doom from your presentation. But it does sound like as if there are some opportunities, and that countries are doing things within their capacity to address some of the fiscal shocks that they're facing, though of course likely this shock is going to continue to be felt for at least the next 3 years, you mentioned, given all things being equal. 5 years, okay. And of course, unfortunately, cocoa producing countries and by extension, farmers within those cocoa producing countries will continue to feel that shock. So it would be great, I think, if we continue during this partnership meeting to think about additional means on the micro level that can be deployed, whatever innovations or thinking out of the box can be deployed to address some of these challenges. So thank you very much, Franziska, and all the presenters, speakers for your interventions today. This concludes our first session of the 2020 World Cocoa Foundation Partnership Meeting. Well, we will meet again. Right now, the item will be nature-based solutions for climate change with Zach Goldsmith, Minister of the Pacific and Environment in the UK. And as Rick had mentioned, COP26 is taking place in the UK next year. So we really do feel that it's really apt timing to hear from Mr. Goldsmith in the lead up to that. See you in a moment. Thank you.